explain to you some extraordinary feats of memories on the part of lower creatures, and then I want to review some of these basic points that would enable you to increase the likelihood of children remembering things by virtue of the way you teach them.
General theories of memory. Isn't so good. What
is the
theory that experience is stored in coded form
by the same
kind of molecule that contains the genetic code, namely deoxyribonucleic acid.
DNA.
We're
talking about
genes, chromosomes. And since the genes
contain
such terrific information, the blueprint that determines what you're going to be like as a human being, it seemed very likely that human memory would
use the same kind of molecule to code
its experience.
and store it.
And you know that every cell,
Whether it's a liver cell,
or a bone cell, a heart cell, or a brain cell, or a skin cell, each cell
contains
the full blueprint
of who you are.
So,
Given the
extraordinary
capacity to store information
of this
large protein
molecule called DNA, there was,
a number of years ago, a major
theory of memory centering around that molecule. It was thought
that
somehow, when experience came to the brain, in some way, it would get coded in a new, by constructing a molecule that would contain that information. About 10 years ago, in 1965, I became very interested in some work at Abbott Laboratories in North Chicago, who were working on
a learning
enhancing drug called magnesium pemoline. Magnesium pemoline is a white, odorless,
tasteless,
non-toxic powder which had been developed during the war for its for use with people who had to watch radar screens and who would get drowsy because watching a radar screen is so boring. And they
Drug.
kept them alert.
They were able to pay attention to a boring thing, like the radar screen. You see, if something's happening every few seconds on the radar screen, it can keep your interest up. But if you're watching, if you're in the dew line, the distant early warning system, you may have to watch at a 4-hour period a radar screen on which nothing happens. Now, if you get drowsy and bored and careless, you start playing solitaire or something else, and you're not watching the screen, that's precisely the time the missile comes through, you see. So you have to sit for 4 hours. Well, it's just ghastly to try to do it. So they developed this drug to help them do it. Well, after the war, some psychologists wondered what this would do to rats. And they began experimenting with magnesium pamoline rats. And they found that they could teach a rat how to swim a complicated maze very much more quickly under the influence of this drug, and that there was very high retention rates. The form of test they used was kind of a desperate one. It was a multiple T maze.
And so you can just go on forever on these sorts of things. Now, what you do is put
Here. And these were underwater swimming mazes. You have a trough. See, your T maze is three-dimensional. It looks like this. See? Well, you get the idea. And you fill this with water, and you put a screen on top so you can't get any air. And you stick the rat in there and put the screen down over the whole thing. Now the rat must find where the air is and say it's here. So every time it makes a wrong turn, time is running out. And so it gets to be a rather desperate learning experience. In other words, if the rat turns here, there's no air. He must swim here. Then and if you have a dead end here like this, and he makes a wrong turn, time is running out. He has to go up here, and he has to either turn left or right. And he turns left, he'll get the hole, and he can get a breath of air. See?
Rats that lose. Rats that lose.
Well, when they can about ready to give up the ghost, and then they let the screen up. But
they found that
magnesium pamoline learned how to swim this very quickly, and that once the rat swam the maze under the influence of magnesium pamoline, second time he never made a wrong turn. In other words, he would remember that you swim up here, it's first a right turn, then it's a left turn, and then it's a left turn. And don't make any other turns, or the air supply will run down very rapidly. Now they would take these rats after training them on the maze with magnesium pamoline and test them again in 3 months. And they found that the rats had very high retention rates, about 95% as I recall. And the difference between the rats who had magnesium pamoline and those who didn't, the difference was statistically significant. So they then became interested to find out, what did magnesium pamoline do? And the theory was that it increased the production of an enzyme in the cortex that increased the production of cortical DNA. An enzyme is an organic catalyst. The catalyst is an agent that facilitates a chemical reaction without itself ultimately being affected. It may enter into the chemical reaction temporarily and to get it going, and then it comes back out and reconstitutes itself and has gotten something going. So the body uses hundreds of different kinds of enzymes to get things moving. They are chemical regulators. They are regulators and initiators of chemical reactions. And it was thought that this was the case with magnesium pamoline. Well, I became very interested because at that time I was working in Head Start. And since the chemical doesn't have any. They did a lot of experiments on it, used it all during the war. It has absolutely no deleterious side effects that anybody ever collected. It seemed to me this would be something worthwhile experimenting on, using with for the benefit of Head Start children. And so I tried to get Head Start approval. Well, people were very sensitive to using their children for guinea pigs, you know. And I feel certain that if I had taken the drug to upper middle class suburban parents and said, say, I got a smart pill here, would you like it? They'd say, oh yes, we'll take 6 quarts. You see, and but the poor parents were nervous because of always being in the position of being manipulated and everything, and they just thought it would be politically unfeasible to use the drug. Well, I went up to see Abbott Lab and said I would like to participate in some studies using young children, and we've gotten the FDA, Federal Drug Administration, clearance for using the drug on young children. And so they said, well, we're about ready to launch a number of dosage studies designed to find out what is the best dosage. And if you'd like to participate in that, we'd welcome it. And I said I would like to, and so we drew straws. About 10 other institutions apparently participated in these studies, and I drew 5 milligrams, which I knew wouldn't be enough to help a flea learn anything. It's too small amount. But anyway, I was stuck with that was the lowest amount, and the institution getting the highest amount, I think, was 75 milligrams. And I put together a very simple concept formation study. And we ran a double-blind placebo study, which is the only kind of scientific data gathering that really amounts to anything on these kinds of studies. You take one group of children and you randomly sort them into 2 groups. By random, I mean every child has equal probability of being in either of these groups. A way to do it would be to put papers in a hat ranging from 1 to 100, and a child would come and draw a piece of paper, and you'd say all the odds go here and all the evens go here. Now the reason you need to randomize a sample when you're going to split them into 2 groups, one's going to be a control group, one's going to be the experimental group. The experimental group gets the treatment, the control group doesn't get the treatment, and then you compare the effects of the treatment versus non-treatment group. The reason you need a random assortment is to control unknown biases. With this approach, if you have 50 girls and 50 boys, it will sort them into roughly 50, half and half in each group, so you have 25 boys and 25 girls in each group. It will control for intelligence. You will have as many high IQs in this group as in this group. In other words, randomization is absolutely essential in constituting control groups and experimental groups for an accurate study. Now, once I got the 2 groups, I want to explain 2 terms, double-blind and placebo. This is the experimental group, and this is the control group. The experimental group got the magnesium pentylamine. The control group got a placebo. A placebo is a pill that is made to look exactly like the magnesium pentylamine, but in fact is made up of milk sugar. And the reason the placebo is important is we know that if people think a pill is going to have a certain effect, it does, even if the pill isn't there. 85% of the population responds to the placebo effect in medicine. If you have a headache and somebody gives you a placebo, it is not an aspirin, but they tell you it's an aspirin, for a large percentage of the population, the headache will go away. Simply because you believe it should go away because you thought you took an aspirin. A lot of medicine proceeds on that basis. So you want to know whether or not this magnesium pentylamine really works, then you have to make certain that people don't understand what way it's supposed to work. Because when they take it, then they will actually alter their behavior in that direction. And now you won't know whether or not the effect is on the effect on their memory was because of the belief that they had that their memories would improve, which caused some internal changes, or whether the drug actually had an effect. So in the case of the studies I ran, well, let me explain what double blind is. The first blind of the double blind means that I was not allowed, as the experimenter, to know which group, which child got the placebo or the magnesium penalty. Because if I knew, and this child came up and was taking the test, unconsciously I might say, if I knew, she's got the magnesium penalty. Well, she didn't do very well on this question, but, well, I think she really knew it. I'll give her credit for it. Whereas if she didn't take it, she'd say, well, she missed it. See? And you introduce lots of biases, and if on large samples you introduce even a little bias like that, eventually it throws off the calculation. The second blind is that the children did not know which they got. And as far as the children were concerned, they thought they were getting a vitamin pill anyway. So we assembled at 7:30 in the morning, because since this is an alerting agent, it's known to keep it, if you take it before you go to bed, you won't feel sleepy. You just sit there like this and wide awake all night. You know, nothing to pay attention to, but you just feel all alert. So we had to give it to them early in the morning so that they wouldn't have insomnia, and it would be out of the systems. After they take it, you let about 30 minutes pass for it to get into the bloodstream, and then you run the experiments within the next 9 minutes, because that's when it's around, and presumably it had time to increase the production of the enzyme, which facilitated the increase in the cortical DNA. So that was the experiment, and we found out no significant difference between, you see, the physician, we had to have a physician because this is a prescribed drug, and he knew, he had a list, and he knew whether he gave a placebo or the magnesium penalty to which child. And so he had that list with all that information, and we just ran the studies, and then we sorted them into two groups and calculated the scores, and there was no significant difference, as I didn't think there would be. Well, I went back to Abbott Labs to give my report, and the guy who had started all of this, brain researcher named Lasky, was nowhere to be seen, and nobody would talk about him. So finally, I just took one of the people aside and said, please, what is going on around here? And everything seemed so hush-hush. Well, to cut a long story short, this research scientist had gotten very short-tempered or testy, sensitive, hypersensitive, when somebody asked to see his data. And he, in running the experiments on rats, would give a shot of magnesium penalty to the rats and a shot of some neutral thing, a saline solution or something, to another group of rats, and then you wait 90 minutes, and then you kill the rat. You scoop out the brains and squeeze it, and then you analyze to see how much DNA is in this pile of juice compared to this pile of juice. And he kept saying that he got more brain RNA in the rats that had magnesium penalty than in the rats that didn't. So the administration of Abbott became concerned about this, and therefore they secretly hired 2 or 3 other firms to replicate the experiment. And the 3 other firms could not find the same differences that he was reporting. And that's a sign something's wrong somewhere. And they finally came to believe that he was fudging the data, and therefore he was released. Well, it's a shame, but it's easy as a scientist. You want to believe something so badly that you will not tolerate any evidence of the contrary, you see. So, since that time, the DNA thesis has kind of settled down a little bit, and nobody's quite sure or absolutely sure about it, but it still remains one possibility. Then there is the what is called the chemical basis of memory, which is similar to DNA and RNA, except it wasn't centered on the particular DNA molecule, was centered on something else, but nobody's quite sure. Now, there was a number of interesting studies done about this, which the implications of which have not been fully explored. They took a group of worms called planaria. They're a rather primitive worm. And they could put the worm into a circle, into a little trough out into the middle of a circle. And they would place food over here and shine a light. And very quickly the worm would learn that when it got to here, that if it went there, there was no food. But if it went where the light was, there would be food. So that no matter where they put the light, the worm would very quickly learn that he should go towards the light, and there he would find food. So they trained a group of planaria to go towards the light to get the food. And presumably then, we could say that there were structural changes somewhere in the nervous system of the worm which enabled him to remember that. Namely, food is where light is. He probably didn't use those words, but he had planaria language. So, they then took a group of these well-educated planaria and ground them up and fed them to dumb planaria. Let's say planaria that had no education. And guess what happened? The planaria who ate their educated colleagues found where the food was statistically significantly more quickly than their friends who hadn't eaten their educated colleagues. So the question became, now how could the memory of food being near light actually get digested and preserved and now into the nervous system of the new worm? Well, as some people said, this has frightening implications for retired professors. And maybe we can, while we're living, sell our brains and to somebody, so when we die, we could be, just before we die, they could be quickly gotten and eaten. And I suppose they'd go down if you put enough ketchup on them. So you can see now that that study introduces some very puzzling possibilities. Another group of studies concerns where does the memory get stored and how does it get transmitted. There was a group of studies done at Fordham University by a guy named William Corney, and they used cockroaches. And you know, cockroaches have been around for millions of years. They are one of the most durable creatures on the planet. And they can make so many physiological changes. If you buy one kind of bug spray, you'll wipe out 3/4 of the generation, but in a very short time, the second generation will be along and it's immune, relatively speaking, to that bug spray. So you have to get another, so you have to keep 5 kinds and alternate them, or you won't wipe out the cockroaches. Their adaptability comes from the fact that they can learn so quickly. They are competent learners, these creatures, except not conscious, so I can't say that it goes along with our definition of evolution. But this experiment had to do with teaching the cockroach to do something with one of its legs. Put a drop of beeswax on the belly of the cockroach and then stuck his legs in it, so that all of his legs are stuck to the beeswax except one, this one. And this leg kind of hangs in a saline solution, salt solution of water, and it has electrical wires and a battery going in it, and you make a connection and you shoot a mini volt up that cockroach's leg. You shine a light right after the light shines, the shock comes. Very quickly the cockroach knows light, shock. So what he does is the minute he sees the light, he pulls his leg out of the saline solution to avoid the shock. And really, they learn very quickly. It's so impressive how quickly you think, gosh, I wish I had a class of kids like that. Now the question is, where did that information, light, shock, get stored? And they wanted to know if it would be transferred to another leg. So they stuck this leg in, the beeswax, teased loose another one, and stuck it in. And if they waited enough time, sure enough, the information would work in the other leg, which meant that there was some kind of higher order mechanism operating to make it happen. But they found by freezing the cockroach's head and so on that the memory was stored in other places other than the head. So we took the cockroach leg, which looks something like this. I'm magnifying it. Right? And with the most delicate of medical equipment, as you might imagine, we took the leg, by we I mean the scientists, took the nerve, mind you, out of the leg of a cockroach that had been educated to lift his leg out of the saline solution when he saw the light. And we transplanted this nerve into the leg of a naive cockroach who didn't know about saline solution in lights, and waited 5 or 6 days until the nerve transplant took and was all set. And would you believe, when we shined the light, the cockroach pulled his educated leg out of the salt solution.
What about the other leg?
Well, he's just missing one. What do you mean? The other leg?
Well, suppose you had the uneducated cockroach with only one transplant. How about the other that wasn't transplanted?
If you wait long enough, the information is transmitted to the other legs.
All of them?
Yep. So that they identified a ganglia, a collection of nerves at the top of the leg, where the information apparently is stored, and that gets transmitted to other legs. So you can see that the plot is very thick and complex. And it's going to take a little while for we have all the information. There are studies going on the level of just people doing memory experiences, like learning lists of words and so on. And that's one kind of. Then there are these kinds of physiological-based studies, which I find far more intriguing and interesting, because I think they're, in the long run, going to be more productive to let us know how things are going with memory. Now, given that as a kind of a background, I want to start talking for a little bit now about some things we do know about how memory is facilitated, and some things about forgetting. Many of these suggestions will be related to what it is in an experience that increases the probability that something will go from short-term into long-term. It's important here to get a distinction between recall and recognition. Recall is far more difficult than recognition, because recognition is possible only with the storage of partial information of the experience. And if you get the cue that touches that, then you can reconstruct the rest. Whereas recall means you just reach in there and get it. And there's just been hundreds of experiences done. There's no doubt that recall is far more difficult and is a more important kind of memory, all other things being equal. Most tests which people give are based on recognition. Multiple choice tests are largely recognition type tests, because if you can recognize something in one of the choices, then you get the answer right, even if you don't know very much about it. And those kinds of tests always undermined me, because I felt that the tester never said the question very well, and therefore I always felt impelled to write little notes in the margin which said, if you mean this, then I pick A, but if you mean that, I pick D. And that's why mindless people get better scores on those tests. Or if they... She just said to her friend, I always do well on those tests, right? No, in fact, I know some very bright people who do those tests, but their approach to it is rather mindless. They don't think too much. If you analyze too much, it will almost always do you in. You should approach it with quite a cavalier attitude and just go down the line, you see. Well, the differences in the two will have to do with the kind of retrieval cue that is attached to the item of information at the time of storage. Obviously, for recall, you've got to have very clear retrieval cues attached to the experience, and then you can get at it again. The main kind of retrieval cue is an association of that item of information or experience with something you have already stored that is well stored, and which you can recall and you have experience in recalling. Now you begin to see here why the Anisa idea of imminence and the role that concept plays in understanding effective instruction, which is individualization of instruction, and the bearing of all of that on memory. Because the retrieval cue that goes to this new experience has got to be an association with something stored in the child's immanence. Immanence being the sum total of stored past that the child has. If you don't know what this is, which means you don't know the child very well, you will not be able to individualize instruction very well, which means you will not be able to help the child attach retrieval cues to items of information, which means that the likelihood of it being remembered is greatly reduced. So if you keep in mind when you're trying to get a child to remember something, the fact that the main retrieval cue will be an association with something the child already knows, you will win half the battles right there. Of course, there's always the possibility of making an erroneous association, or just having gotten the thing wrong in the first place, the experience that you had. You mistook one thing for another thing, and then you attach a retrieval cue to it, which makes an association, the bond of which has dubious characteristics. Then that's how confusion gets introduced into the whole system. And as a matter of fact, the look-say method of reading is, in a very general way, designed to confuse people, confuse the child. Not initially, and so that's why the child with the look-say method learns to read very quickly. But then, pretty soon, when certain new words are introduced, mass confusion reigns, and now you have the frustration and
Before, be very hard.
number of words, the spelling for which they cannot remember, because they have it stored 6 different ways in their head, all of them labeled right and wrong, so that you now can't remember which is right and which is wrong. I can never remember, for instance, whether a cross has 2 C's or 1. And now, if I would take the time to figure out a device to put a retrieval cue on it that identifies it as right, then I would be okay. The look-say method of teaching reading creates almost universally very bad spellers, because the distinguishing characteristic of the word that the child's attention is directed to is not the letters that make it up, but its shape and its first letter, and therefore confusion is introduced. A category name is one of the most useful of all retrieval cues, particularly if that category name can be connected with something in the immanence or the background of the child. To have a category is to have a peg on which to hang something. And once you know the category, and the experience that fits the criteria attributes that define the category will fit into it. That's why we place such emphasis on classification, and that's why one of the first specifications that all the children had in Suffield was the classification specification. Because once children come to classify, it is perhaps the single greatest aid to memory. And to know how to classify means that you can, in part, have more control over the quality of your own memory once you know that this is the case. You have some place to put it. You see, if you have pigeonholes with names of things over them, then when you have an experience, you have a place to put it. If you don't have that, and you just have a big bushel basket and you toss everything in it when it comes in, then of course when you want to retrieve it, you have to sort through every single item to see whether or not it's there. Of course, one of the most remarkable things about human memory is that you can remember that you knew it, but you don't know where it is now and you can't find it. Well, it's the same way, you know. You know that in your messy office that you had a piece of paper with a memorandum on it to do something, somebody's telephone number, but you can't find out where you put it, and so you might hunt all day and never find it. Well, it's the same way. You say, well, I know that. Or you say, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't get it. Or, I know her name as well as I know my mother's name. And you say, well, what's your mother's name? You say, well, I know that as well as my father's name. You can't remember any of it. So we're pretty sure that having the categories set up is one of the chief ways of facilitating memory. And if you short out part of the brain that destroys the categorization, then memory goes. And there is, I think, a lot of virtue in the pattern of firing thesis of memory, because when you give electroconvulsive therapy to a person, you short out the connection such that the pattern, the routine pattern, is altered, and there is always memory loss with electroconvulsive therapy, especially right when you come out of it. I think we talked about this last week, did we not, or did we? So that when you come out of the treatment, you don't even know who you are, hardly. And it takes a little while during the course of the day for the memory to come back. But if your troubles are associated with your memory, if you destroy the memory, the troubles go. But now your trouble is you don't know who you are. And that's mildly anxiety-provoking. So let me give you a concrete example of the retrieval cue where classification is concerned, and attaching it to immanence. If you are trying to get a child to remember some item, place that item in a broader category with other things. Then make sure that a fair amount of those other things are items which are already stored. If you do, you will be building up the hierarchical sequence and he will be able to retain it. Now, on top of that, there are a number of things that are important. One has to do with what George Miller calls chunking. His work related to overloading the system and what that means. He's the one who found out that if you have more than 5 to 7 unconnected items, you can't remember them. So the way to reduce overload is to make sure you don't go over 5. And if you want to have more information than just 5 items, connect them. His point is that you can have 5, you can remember 5 quite different items. But if you had 500 items here, but they all got connected with this, you could have 500 items here, but if you organized them under that, then you can still remember these 5 plus almost an infinite number of things that might be related under it. So that once you have, in other words, if you establish 7 categories, you can place hundreds of things in all those categories and remember them all. Now, the reason we were very interested in this, and I think our own experience confirms it, is that a comprehensive educational system would necessarily contain so much information that it would overload the memory. But if you had a conceptual scheme that organized the categories and connected them, then it would not overload the memory. And I think we have demonstrated that with Anisa. Once you have a coherent theoretical system, then 10,000 items of information can get filed and stored. See, it would be very difficult if all this information I've gone through over the last few days, and I don't use very many notes, how could all of that get stored and retrieved? Well, it gets stored and retrieved because it hangs together. It hangs together because it's been chunked. It just isn't hanging out there separately. Things are connected. That's why we think it's possible ultimately to train a teacher in the body of theory, because it's put together and its coherence connects it. That makes it meaningful, and that means that you increase the probability of it's being stored. Once you begin to understand the terminology and it begins to connect with your own experience and so on. Next item. Rehearsal and repetition are key factors. If a child is not allowed to do the same thing several times, you reduce the probability of its being stored. And we know that very well in terms of playing the violin or the piano or riding a bicycle. He's got to be able to do it over and over and over again. You introduce the probability of boredom, however, if you do exactly the same thing over and over again. That's why it's always good to attach a little novelty to it, which is consistent with our thesis of the perpetual introduction of novelty. Don't make too much novelty, otherwise it'll seem like a different experience and it won't be repetition anymore. But you need just a little bit tacked onto it to keep the interest up, and the child will go on repeating it. In many cases, however, young children just like repeating it because there is a certain joy that comes from the consolidation, the experience of consolidation that comes from repeating the same thing over and over and over again. Sometimes it's difficult for adults to work with young children simply because they like to do it over and over again. And that's why if you have a younger child that is closer developmentally to the level of another child, and you have this slightly more advanced child teaching the one that isn't so advanced, they enjoy the repetition together. And they don't mind it, so one makes a good teacher of the other one. Now, one reason rehearsal and repetition is helpful is that in the course of the repetition, subjective organization emerges. Let's look at 2 kinds of organization, just briefly. One might be called objective organization, and the other called subjective organization. Let me give you an example. In the list of things that, in the little study that we just did, I won't refer to that, I'll refer to something fresh. Supposing I ask you to come up and look at the things on this table. An objective kind of organization of these papers might be that they are all related to memory, and this lecture is about memory. And it is objectively identifiable as items related to memory. And so you would organize this experience on the basis of that category name. That would be objective organization. Subjective organization would be, an example of that would be somebody who comes up and looks at these things and said, oh, I have a grandmother who had a dress this color. And I have an uncle who has a car this color. And they pick subjective experiences in their past that somehow get associated with this, which wouldn't work for anybody else. Now, people use both subjective and objective forms of organization. Teachers are only able to help a child on objective organization, because unless they know the child terribly, terribly, terribly intimately. But all children will use a combination of both. But when they use subjective organization, it's not communicable to anybody else quite so readily. And it may work very well for that one child, but it wouldn't work well for anybody else, because if you don't have a grandmother with a red dress, well, then that's out for you. And there's nothing there. Now, we could, by repetition, get you to believe that you had a grandmother with a red dress, but then that's just the burden of storing that information, rather than drawing on something that's already there, you see. Now, the problem comes when subjective organization is in conflict with objective organization. In other words, something that you had in the past that you're associating things with now interferes with or confuses the objective organization. That's why, from our point of view, teachers should guide the organization of the experience such that they increase the probability of it being stored on some relatively objective classification basis. Then, if you know the child and some intimate experience, you can add that too. Remember the time we went down and your grandmother took you out to see the beaver dam, this and that and everything else? Then you can associate that with something highly subjective on the part of the child, if you know the child that way. But people whose lives and their memories are organized subjectively are people who don't proceed with many things systematically. And they're far more capricious and whimsical in the way they approach experience because of that fact. All right, next item. So the point of all that is don't think that rehearsal and repetition are bad. Yes?
Wouldn't subjective organization be, occasionally anyway, a boon to divergent thinking?
Absolutely. That's why you don't want to rule it out. Subjective organization is a boon to divergent thinking. In fact, that's what it depends on. You see this thing and you connect it with something, a remote associate, and then you connect that thing with another remote associate, and it takes you way out on a limb. And then when you try to see what the connection is between that thing way out on the limb and where you started, you may get a new perspective on it, and that new perspective would represent creativity in that sense. I want to talk now about the nature of review, which is different from rehearsal. Rehearsal is when you do something right in a row, right after you first get it. Review means letting some time lapse and then going back over it. studies show that if you review fairly soon after the first experience, it's better off than putting it off too long. In other words, if you have an experience in the, say at 11:30, and you're introducing long division to the children, if you review it again at 2:30, that's better off than waiting 2 days. There will be such a time decay loss. Whereas if you review it at 2:30, and then if you reviewed it again at 4:30 before they went home, maybe they're not even in school before 4:30, but if you reviewed it 3 times in the same day, it would stick. And when you came to it 3 days later, you would have far more of it, and it stuck, than if you only introduced it and then let 3 days go by. And in other words, review fairly soon after the initial experience, 2 or 3 times, and then it'll stick. If you spread it out too far, you lose each time. It's a little bit as if when you remember something, there is a pattern of electrical impulses that goes from one nerve to another nerve to another nerve to another nerve, maybe through 5 or 6 million of them, in a certain way. And once it's gone that way, if you do it again and again, there are changes. In fact, they've shown that there are changes in the size once learning takes place in the area of the synapse. Then if you let an hour pass and do it again, it now really begins to consolidate all of that. So we somehow think, because we're bound to this scheduling business, the 50 minutes of math Monday, Wednesday, and Friday or something, that you couldn't, once you introduce a new math idea, review it again, maybe 10, 15 minutes, 4 times during the same day that you introduced it. But you see, if you're basing your operation on what we know about human memory, you'd be much better off to do that. You could afford to give up math the following 2 days. You'd have greater gains if you would, in other words.
Now, doesn't this, won't this say something then about the way we test, that every 6 weeks and then, you know, every semester and the like?
Well, sure. I mean, all of this stuff has implications for testing, because a test is simply designed to see whether or not you can recall or recognize things and retrieve from the memory certain things. In fact, I was just talking with something Dawn told me that I never got onto myself. And that is that you can boost your test score on a reading comprehension test if you will read the questions that are going to be asked you before you read the paragraph that gives you the information, because now you know what you're looking for. So all you have to do is tell. So I was telling my daughter the other day, was taking some reading tests this summer. I said, honey, how do you do it? She said, well, I read the paragraph first, and I try to answer the questions. I said, read the questions first. This is, I say, Don's idea. I guess it's a well-known thing, but I'd never heard of it before. And really, it now cues you to things to look for. And therefore, when you come to them, you recognize them, and you can do it quicker. Yes?
Yeah, but as a student, I would find that far less interesting than reading the thing first. I just don't like to do that. I'd rather have a continuity.
Oh, yes, but it depends on your objective. If you're trying to get a high score,
Well,
you
yeah.
should do it this way. If that's what you're interested in.
I'm not sure,
Yes, you see.
I'm not sure that a high score on the test, I'm just not sure it's worth all that.
Well, it is if you're going after a job. Yeah? Well, it depends on your purpose again. Purpose structures the activity. If your main objective is to get a high score, then do it this way. If your main objective is to enjoy yourself, then maybe you don't want to do it that way. See?
But I always enjoy taking tests.
You always enjoy taking, yes, right.
I wouldn't like to change my style for that.
Well, you don't have to. But then you just come up looking like a dummy. Well, I always did very badly on those kinds of tests myself.
But I did well.
You did well. Well, that's why you like doing it the way you do it, because you're successful at it. I need the crutch of having the analysis, the framework of analysis before me when I go through it the first time. Another element has to do with attentional functions. They are important determinants of memory. If a child is not paying attention, it doesn't get into short-term memory, and therefore there is no way it can get into long-term memory. So if a child isn't paying attention, you're just wasting your breath. Now, of course, if you're talking to 30 kids, you can't just stop for one kid. Well, you can quickly, but it sort of breaks the train of thought if you stop and say, Johnny, pay attention back here now. Then that distracts the attention of everybody else, so it's hard to know what to do. But if you're working with a child on a small group basis or a one-to-one basis, and you can tell that he's not paying attention, then you can forget it. Now, here's the question. Can you do something which increases the probability of attention as you're doing whatever it is you're doing? And there are many things. The primary one of which is the organization of what you are doing in such a way that it connects with him so it's meaningful. Having meaning or sensing meaning, even if it's new meaning, will never be absolutely new. But it is hard to pay attention if you aren't understanding what's going on for long periods of time. You just can't hold on to it. You'll just tune out. And that has been so well demonstrated. That's why the individualization of instruction is so important. Because if you're over the heads of some, they will tune out. They have no choice but to tune out, you see. And of course, the more they tune out, the more that's a bad habit that's being developed of just inattention. And you come to just not hear anymore. You practice blotting out, and that's a bad habit. Organization is a function, the organization of the information that you're going to store is a function both of the material itself, which has some kind of objective organization as we were talking, plus a function of the individual, his own immanence. And that's why the more you know a child, the more you can connect the actual organization inherent in the material with something that's in the organization of the child. When you get both of them going together, the probability of memory is increased. Now, a lot of studies show that the novel thing that gets introduced is remembered best in a sequence of activities. That substantiates our basic thesis about the need to introduce novelty gradually. Novelty does another thing. It boosts attention. The minute there's something slightly new on the scene, attention brightens up, and attention facilitates memory, and therefore the introduction of novelty is an important facilitator of memory.
Dan, that's a hand.
Yes.
Does adrenaline in the system affect learning or memory?
Yes, in a number of ways.
Plus or minus, or does it kind of...
No, it helps if it's a little bit, because adrenaline keeps one a little more alert, and alert means there is more sensitivity to stimuli, which is a key element in attention. It causes a dilation of blood vessels, which means more blood is usually carried to the brain, which means there's more sugar and more oxygen, which is what the brain needs in order to function maximally. That kind of leads me into the next notion, and that is that fatigue is an enemy of memory. So that if you're reading something and you're too tired and you really want to remember it, you're really kind of wasting your time. Now, if you are, for instance, if you're attending a lecture and you're very sleepy, you can hold things in short-term memory long enough to get them down. But you won't remember any of it, but at least you could refer to your notes later. I'm not talking about anybody in particular this morning. But if you try to, you will have the experience that if late at night you are trying to read rather serious material, that in the morning, if you were terribly tired when you read it, in the morning, practically none of it will be there. You won't be able to, I mean, I lose whole books that way. I hardly have a chance to do anything when I'm fresh. I'm always doing all my reading when I'm about ready to pass out. And it's just bad but I don't seem to be able to, with all the constraints on me, do my reading at the best time, which would be right after you've had a light breakfast with a lot of protein in it. That's when you should do your reading. But when do you get to do it? No, you have to be at work attending to trivial issues at 8 in the morning. It's so desperate the way we've organized ourselves we've organized our lives so that we come out being dumb most of the time, really. We should do our best work at 8 in the morning. Yes?
Can I go back a step?
Yes.
About the adrenaline thing. You hear people talking about clutching on tests.
Clutching?
Clutching, or, becoming over-anxious.
Oh, yes,
Would that have anything? What is that? Why would that...
Yeah, if it goes too much. If you don't have any, that's bad. If you have too much, that's bad. It's best to have just a little bit. Now, let me just go through a list of items on my cards here, and one of them deals with that. It says emotional attitudes or emotional states which lower the registering and recall efficiency sometimes to 0 are the following: anxiety, apprehension, confusion, depression, displeasure, embarrassment, frustration, grief, hatred, inferiority, feeling, self-consciousness, stage fright, and shame. Well, that's why we can't remember anything, right? We all have one or two of these things going all the time. So you can see why it's important for a child to be in an atmosphere where there is things slightly on the exciting side, but not anxiety-provoking, not embarrassing, not confusing, not depressing, not all those things. Dick?
One of the things that strikes me, I don't know where, but if you say to this group, you're now going to have to give this lecture to another group of people this afternoon, it somehow increases the learning or the memory or the attention. I'm not sure what that...
Only for some. There would be some that it would just tie up in a knot, and they would be babbling idiots when their time came to present the lecture. But for others, that's because you now have a different purpose. And purpose structures what you learn. There's no doubt about it. And therefore, if you know you have to give it this afternoon, then you get everything down in a different way than you would otherwise. I want to talk for a little bit about mnemonic devices. These are devices which are kind of gimmicky, but nonetheless they help you remember things because a retrieval cue has been attached to them. Here's one I use to remember the difference between stalactites and stalagmites. Do you know what the difference is between them? Yeah, one's up and one's down. I know that too, but which is which? Have you got one?
T for top.
Oh, T for top.
C for ceiling.
But what
C
T?
for ceiling.
Yeah, I use C for ceiling and G for ground.
Stalactites.
So the stalagmites come up from the ground and the stalactites hang down from the ceiling. What? Stuck tight to the ceiling, yes. Well, you can often help a child remember to recall the differentiation by one of these mnemonic devices. I remember I could never remember whether to spell believe B-E-L-I-E-V-E or B-E-L-E-I-V-E, or whether receive was R-E-C-E or R-E-C-I-E-V-E. And because one is one way and the other is the other way. And so she said, I after L and E after C. Lies. Let that run through your head. So that's a little mnemonic device. So, now I thought that would be particularly appropriate in Suffolk. And given your eminence on the situation, I think that you will now have no trouble remembering this mnemonic device about the difference between believe and receive. Yes.
Sometimes it can backfire on you. This is literally true. There's a junior high teacher who for 15 years taught the difference between ascend and descend, and she was always surprised because it brought such uproarious laughter until somebody told her after 15 years. She'd say descend out, ascend up.
Yes, well, we'll remember that one. Whenever, the next time you come across a memory problem, stop for a moment